You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Well, welcome to Bookstorm. We have a little announcement to make before we get started. We're happy to report we are now in almost 50 states, including Hawaii. We have followers in Japan, Germany, Argentina, and Australia. Hello and thank you to those listeners. We have a special treat for you here today. We have Samantha Greene Woodruff with her amazing debut novel, The Lobotomist Wife. Samantha has a MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. She spent most of her career telling stories to executives at MTV Network, also as Senior Vice President of Strategy and Business Development. She did audience research for Nickelodeon Family and Kids Group. How cool is that? After leaving corporate life, she pursued her varied passions, yoga, cooking, taking classes at the Writing Institute at St. Lawrence College. But we're here to talk to her today about this amazing debut novel. The Lobotomist Wife was Amazon First Reads Pick of the Month. The book is listed as #1 under Amazon Psychological Fiction. Wow. Sam has interviews, written articles, and has been honored by Writer's Digest, Historical Novel Society, Women Writers, Women Books, Newsweek, the bestseller, Prose Podcast, and City Book Review. Paulette Kennedy, author of Parting the Veil, says, The Lobotomist's Wife shines a light onto an underreported but fascinating aspect of medical history. It's both tense and informative. It's a timely story, not only of hubris, ambition, but also empathy and the search for truth. We can't wait to dig down deep into this fascinating tale. Sam lives in Connecticut with her husband, 2 children, and 2 dogs.
Samantha, we like to give our listeners a little bit of the backstory. So if you'll indulge me, I thought without giving away any spoilers, I could tell them just a little bit about your book. You've written an enthralling historical novel about a very compassionate woman, about a cutting-edge breakthrough in psychiatry, and about really a nightmare in the making, which is what holds our attention. I couldn't put this book down. In the story, we follow Ruth, who is an heiress, and Ruth's brother, when he returned from World War I, was dealing with mental health struggles with PTSD, and he died by suicide. Her life's devotion became caring for people with mental health issues. At the hospital where she works, she ends up falling in love with a charismatic doctor. And over time, he believes that he has developed a cure-all, a treatment for mental health. And unfortunately, it spirals a little bit out of control. In the story, we meet a young woman who is about to seek some treatment. And again, I don't want to give away any spoilers. But Ruth becomes the central focus here because only she can potentially save this young woman. This novel was inspired by a shocking chapter in medical history, but it's also the very personal story of a determined, intelligent woman up against an incredible ego. And this is all against the context of a long-wanted marriage, which is what also made this so fascinating. So Samantha, Chris, are you ready to brave the storm?
We sure are. Samantha, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Okay. One word for this book. Wow. a profound story. It's based in truth that this is a must read for everyone. You have woven an incredible story from historical truths that show the danger in any profession of placing yourself above your cause. We see the trap of prideful egos. We see people slowly forgetting why they first began their great quest or cause and getting caught up in the fame and recognition. I think this can happen in any career, any profession, even any volunteer work or charity. Your story cautions the reader that we can almost begin to believe our own lies. My question for you as the writer, what traits did Frank, the lobotomist, possess? What did you instill in him that you believe made him fall so easily into this prideful trap?
So Robert, the lobotomist, Frank is the husband of
Yes, Robert the lobotomist. Sorry,
just for readers, so they're not confused.
Yes, Robert the lobotomist.
He's not a secret lobotomist on the side. So in writing the book, I was really interested in using lobotomy as a way to explore the great lengths that people will go to fit in and feel better. But in dealing with the lobotomist and in writing about the lobotomist, I was really inspired by somebody who was a real life figure, Walter Freeman II, who was the man who pioneered lobotomy in the United States. He didn't invent it, but he brought it over from Europe and then invented the 10-minute outpatient ice pick version of the procedure. So, and much of, well, my novel doesn't end the same way that the facts ended. And I don't want to, again, give away any spoilers. My lobotomist, Robert Apter, is very much inspired by the man himself, Walter Freeman, and many of his character traits are as such, as reported I did a ton of research. And Walter Freeman, maybe more than Robert even, was driven by ego and a need to succeed. His grandfather had been this unbelievable doctor and inventor and scientist, and he really wanted to make his mark the way his grandfather had. And I think that was a big driving force in Freeman's life. And so I wanted the reader to understand that you could have this drive and couple it with, a physician's desire to do good, and that it could really go wrong, because it did in real life, right? I mean, the actual Walter Freeman didn't stop performing lobotomies until 1967, and that was only because he killed somebody.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's an amazing, we did a little side research into lobotomy and did see that so many facts from your story were based on truth. How did you come up with this idea? Did you find an article?
Yes. So I had this corporate career, as you made sound much more important than it was, but I worked in corporate America and had an MBA, which was never where I thought I was going to be. I was actually a history major in undergrad. And I got to this crossroads where I had one young child. I was pregnant with my second child. We had moved from Manhattan to the suburbs, and my husband had an even more demanding career than I did. And we had to figure things out. And I really wanted to be home and available to my kids. So I stopped working. And that's when I started teaching yoga and doing all these other things, one of which was taking a class at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College. And I started playing around with this novel writing class, writing a story, a contemporary story about a woman who was yearning for more in her life and started acting out in all sorts of ways. And really it was about me, except I wasn't doing such extreme acting out. But it was kind of like a meh book. And concurrently, I was listening to a nonfiction book called Get Well Soon by a woman named Jennifer Wright, who incidentally, I have now befriended on Instagram I'll tell you that story in a second. It's a good one. It was it's my best writing moment so far since the book came out. She had a chapter about lobotomy. The book is really mostly about, it's called, the subtitle is History's Worst Plagues and the Men Who Fought Them, or the People Who Fought Them. But she says, as she opens the lobotomy chapter, that she couldn't write the book without covering lobotomy because it was such an egregious moment in the history of medicine. And she really tells the story of Walter Freeman. And I remember driving along this tree-lined street, listening to this chapter, and all of a sudden it clicking that this wasn't like in 1550. This was in the 1940s. Rosemary Kennedy was lobotomized by Walter Freeman. And I had this moment where I said, oh my God, what if my housewife, my protagonist of my contemporary novel, happened to be unlucky enough to be alive in this brief moment in time where lobotomy might have been a good answer for her ills. And that was where the seed of the idea came from. And then I came home to my husband and said, I have this idea. What if I switched and wrote a book about lobotomy? And he said, that's the book. You got to do that book. And so it went from there. And then I did a deep dive and learned everything I could about the medicine of the time, about lobotomy, about mental illness, about mental health conditions. And from there, kind of pieced the story together.
Fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yes.
For everyone listening. We can all relate to this story in some way because everyone has known someone who's had depression or someone in their family or friends with mental illness, and how we've changed over the years is amazing. That leads kind of into Kristen's next question.
Although I do want to hear the story about Jennifer Wright, so make sure you get back to that.
Before we're done, for sure.
One of the characters in your story that we haven't talked about really yet is Margaret, and I thought it was very powerful. Again, without giving away anything, this character was dealing with some mental health struggles. It was attributed to the fact that she had the baby blues, that maybe she was hysterical, whatever. But a lot of times we see in medical history where women's concerns were dismissed as women's concerns. And I was wondering if you thought in your research, if you've run across this, where we are a little bit behind in terms of medical research as it relates to women because of this dismissive attitude.
Yes. So that is a big piece of what I wanted to tackle head on as much as I could, even if it wasn't totally direct in writing this novel. Most of Freeman, more than half of Freeman's patients were women.
Wow.
And so lobotomy was a commonly used treatment for women's issues. And that came after, in previous generations when, as you mentioned, we had hysteria and we had, women's conditions were often dismissed as just problems of the weaker sex and treated really bluntly and brutally. Yeah. And I think that, Margaret, I don't think it gives away too much to say that Margaret has postpartum depression. I wanted her to have postpartum depression because I think it is such an illustrative disease in the arc that it's had in our society in the last 70 years. I found articles in Better Homes and Gardens from the 50s about postpartum depression but it wasn't called that. It was called baby blues. And they basically said, you just need to take a warm bath and have a night's sleep or two, or go to the market for an hour and get away from your baby. And so this idea that there was something more that really needed to be addressed as an illness was, I think it's only really been normalized in the last decade or two, just postpartum depression. So yes, I think we do lag behind in many ways on mental health issues for women, for sure.
That part of your story really struck a chord with me for a lot of reasons. One of them is I'm an environmental attorney, and I represent people who are being poisoned by contaminants migrating onto their property. And way back in the 70s, we had a situation out of the area where we live called Love Canal. And a lot of people may not be familiar with Love Canal, but it was a major environmental disaster. The women who led the charge to uncover and expose what was going on were dismissed as hysterical housewives. And so that slowed down the process of investigating and researching simply because the concerns were initially raised by women. And that was something that, as I was reading your book, I kept thinking about that, because look at how much we squandered time and medical research and even resources because of this dismissive attitude, which I thought was excellent that you highlighted that. The other thing I thought was very interesting with respect to Margaret was we saw in her relationship with Ruth this beautiful friendship that breathed life back into Margaret. And just that whole idea of relational connection was really important.
So it's interesting. My mom and stepfather are both psychotherapists. And so I say I kind of grew up with therapy almost as my religion, because we talked about everything. And I think I'm a therapist by osmosis. And I really wanted to set Ruth as a juxtaposition to Robert, the lobotomist, in that she was able to be more relational with patients and to see this kind of broader spectrum of treatment in while concurrently being so desperate for a cure that she really believed in some things that were pretty barbaric, including lobotomy. And I think that was the dilemma of mental health professionals, even the best meaning mental health professionals in earlier times, is that it was hard to know what was going to work sometimes. And so, there is this danger of history repeating itself in those ways, because how far do you go? What do you think is okay? Look, we have this with the debates over the COVID vaccine now, not to get political, but it's too soon to tell in some ways, right? All we know is that we have to embrace it to keep our society safe. At least that's my personal belief. No one else has to agree with it, but science moves fast. And so what seems right in a moment may not seem right 20 years later. Mm-hmm. And I wanted Ruth to be someone who always remained open to that change as much as possible, in spite of the fact that everything in her life was leading her to really want to believe that she had found this cure. And that's bigger than men or women. That's just about the progress of society, really, right? Anyway,
no, that's an excellent point. And that's just the progress of medicine. So
right.
That ties in with my next question. I just believe that we've come such a long way in medicine from the early 1900s. And your book really showed us, like, our grandparents were taught to respect and accept whatever their physician said, whatever the diagnoses and prognoses were. They did not feel comfortable questioning that. But today, with all of the resources that we're given today, and with the internet, we have enough tools to educate ourselves about our medical treatment, pose intelligent questions, make better choices. I want to add that, of course, we're always thankful to our medical community, but we have come such a long way in understanding that we are all only human, including these physicians, and we have a right to question our own treatment. Was this something that a theme that you also may have been wanting to expose, in just the juxtaposition between those two characters? Because Ruth wanted a cure so badly, but she was still willing to question.
So I think that I wish that I was actually trying to get that. But the truth is, really, I was much more interested in the fear and maybe titillation, the sort of thriller aspect of what you're talking about, which is that even today, as much as we can be our own advocates, there is still this feeling that you trust the doctor as the expert. And so to think about putting yourself in a situation that makes you vulnerable in that way is fundamentally a little bit nerve-wracking. And then to understand that there are many medical professionals even today. I just finished watching Dr. Death, which was on Peacock, which is based on a podcast about a real spinal surgeon who had no idea how to do a surgery and really maimed a lot of people. You make yourself so vulnerable in the desire to get well. And so for me, it was more about exploring that. What does it mean to want to get better and want to feel good and feel happy? And when does it make sense to offer that vulnerability? And when do you need to stop and say, wait, hold on a minute? and trust yourself.
Excellent point. And in the brain, this whole idea of lobotomy, the brain is still, I think, one of the organs that we know the least about. They're still making new discoveries day by day, year by year. And yes, I suppose for a lot of people who suffered from depression back then, there was a desperation. Help me with something, anything. What kind of terrified me in your book was this idea that the husband was making the decision on behalf of the wife and dropping them off and saying, this is what you have to do. What a change we've made from there to today. Thank goodness.
I initially, when I conceived of the story, first of all, Margaret, who is the 1950s housewife, was the protagonist. And in my very initial conception, her husband was going to be the one pushing for her to have a lobotomy. And again, I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that what I decided is that I wanted this to be a book about female agency. I wanted my protagonists to have strength and control of their own destinies as much as possible. And so for me, it was much more powerful and just as feasible that Margaret would be the one who wants to have the lobotomy, even though there's this sort of Stepford wife concept of like the husband says, here, make my wife into the Barbie doll I want her to be. For Margaret, she wants to be what she thinks she's supposed to be, and she can't. And so there's something so poignant about that I also think is so relatable to today, and certainly was relatable to me when I was first a suburban housewife who had given up my job and said, wait a minute, I'm not happy doing just this. And how do we change our circumstances? So, I think there's a delicate interplay of all of that going on. At least I'm trying for that in the book.
You nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. And also we've come such a long way with mental illness. We understand that it is not your fault. The brain is an organ. There's not this stigma to it that was so many years ago. And people, I think, are more apt to voice, hey, I'm having problems, I need help. Or to be able to see a loved one and say, I think you need to go see a doctor and get some medication or whatever it is you need. And we've come a long way. I think your book sort of prompted us to understand that too, that it's okay to get help. And it's okay to voice if you're not feeling well. And you don't have to have anyone tell you that you're not allowed to feel this way if this is how you really feel. It speaks for, I think, a whole group of people that need a voice, this book as well.
Thank you. And I think, it ended up being timely about mental health because of the pandemic, because so many people are suffering so much more. When I was writing it, I thought it was timely. I was like in a race to get it written because of Me Too, because I felt like that movement was another way in which women who hadn't been heard or seen before were finding their voice. And so it's interesting to think about all of the ways that something that takes place in the past echo current society. And, some of that was by design and some of it just is what it is. So there's both. And I think that, if you were to ask me what the key takeaway I want people to have from the book is, in that realm, it's both to know that you can seek help, but also to know that being uncomfortable in a moment in life is okay too. Like none of us feel perfect all the time. None of us feel great. And seeking that level of perfection and constant happiness is unrealistic. And, taken to its extreme, it could lead to the obliteration of personality via lobotomy. But I don't think most of us are going to go there.
Definitely not now, anyway, after reading this. Yes. But it's so true. So, yes, we do have this almost false norm, also promoted by social media, that we look at everyone else and think lives are so perfect and everyone is so happy, and why am I not having a good day? And that's a really good little gem for our listeners to take with us, that every day is not going to be a good day. We live in the real world, and we're going to have hurdles and we're going to have difficulties, and all that's okay. It's normal.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on something you said a second ago about this book being timely. It is for many reasons. One of them being we are seeing right now the tremendous impacts of mental health issues associated with veterans. And we're losing many veterans every day. These are shockingly high numbers. And in fact, people early on recognized the impact of war. You had referenced, for example, Ruth's brother was struggling after World War I when he came back a different person. And I really was thinking about how in some ways we are in some of the early stages of understanding mental illness, mental health issues. And I was starting to think about these cures. And, we have some things coming on the horizon. For example, with magic mushrooms, with the psychedelic mushrooms. This is an incredibly promising, I don't want to say cure, but treatment perhaps. And I was wondering if you could comment on the cautionary tale aspect of your book. Do we embrace these quickly, or do we?
So, I mean, I am fascinated particularly by the psilocybin and the ketamine and all of these treatments that are slowly becoming not quite mainstream yet, because I don't think they're sanctioned. I think they're still kind of being done under the radar for the most part. But I've always sort of thought neurochemistry was interesting. And so this idea that you can create new neural pathways at any point in your life, like this comes more from my yoga meditation background, right? That meditation helps you retrain the brain in certain ways. And that's the concept of these psychedelics, that you can take a trauma that like a horrible, moment of life as a soldier, and you can retrain your brain's reaction to it by taking a drug that will do that. It sounds amazing. It also sounds a little like Brave New Worlds. And so I guess the question, I mean, do I say proceed with caution? It's hard to say. I think progress is an amazing thing. And so I tend to lean into it, but who knows? It's hard to know. I mean, so I would hate to be the one to say, yes, it's good, or no, it's bad, because it's too soon to tell, but you got to keep researching. And then I think the critical thing, if I were going to boil it down, thinking about the Lobotomist as a cautionary tale, about Walter Freeman and my fictional lobotomist as a cautionary tale, is you have to always ask questions and look at the data, right? I have a line in the book that says something like that, Robert saw every success as a success and every failure as an exception to his success. And those aren't the exact words, but that's the difference, right? Is being willing to look at the data and say, okay, this isn't working. It's not yielding the result I thought. Let's try something different.
Yeah.
So,
well, and also, the characters were very hopeful that potentially there was a cure, and your desire is to run towards it. And I know this feeling. In my own life, I had somebody very close to me who died by suicide. And I remember in the months leading up, all I wanted was, we need a cure. And in fact, that's when a lot of these early stories were coming out about psilocybin and some of the potential associated with this approach. And I remember thinking, why are we waiting for trials? Let's just make this available right now. But again, that's where that cautionary nature comes in too, because we don't fully understand the brain, let alone some of the treatments and chemistry that we're introducing into it.
So true. And a lot of this new holistic, this homeopathic medication. I remember when my mother was ill with cancer, I had went to a homeopathic pharmacy and gotten all these different meds for her. When I took it to her oncologist, he said, these are all great, but these are real drugs and they could interact with what I'm giving her. So I think now as a society, we're a little more willing to look at some of these natural substances, legalization of marijuana for one in many states, really helping people with chemotherapy sickness. And well, it's just an eye-opening story, Samantha. Amazing.
Thank you.
So can you tell us, I saw a little on your website that you're starting another book. What's on your radar here?
So, yes, I'm completely shifting gears, still historical fiction. I am in the early stages of research and writing a novel about twins, a brother and sister, who their parents are Jewish immigrants in the early 1900s, and they come of age and have great success in the 1920s stock market boom and real estate boom and bust. And it's a story about siblings, and it's a story about what it is to kind of be an outsider in an inside, trying to break into the inside world. But then it's also about the stock market of the 1920s and short selling the crash of 1929. So where if this one taught you about lobotomy and medicine, the next one will teach you a little something about stocks and investments and the market of the 1920s and what it means to be a short seller, which I'm learning myself.
That sounds intriguing too. We're definitely going to want to pick that book up. So thank you, Samantha. For our listeners, I just want to say you're going to want to go out and get this book, The Lobotomist Wife. It is eye-opening, intriguing, and connect with Samantha on social media, Samantha Greene Woodruff, and on her interactive website. And we hope to see you again sometime on Bookstore Podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And you can log off whenever. We're going to stay on and talk for a few minutes. Pleasure having you.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you guys the Jennifer Wright story because it's so funny.
Yes.
So I reached the day that my book came out. I reached out to her because the man who wrote the biography of Walter Freeman called The Lobotomist reached out to me. He sent me a direct message on Instagram and said, "Congratulations on your launch. And I hope my book was helpful." And so I wrote him back and we had a little back and forth exchange and he sent me a signed copy of his book and I sent him a signed copy of mine. And I said, you know what? In every interview and in my author's note, I bring up Jennifer Wright and this book. And I think she's so amazing. She's a young woman. She's younger than I am. She has a baby. She's on Instagram. And so I pinged her on Instagram and sent her a screenshot of the author's note where I mentioned her. And I said, "I just want you to know my book launched today. And I'm so indebted to you because of this." And she literally seconds later wrote back, all caps, "OMG, I was just about to buy your book."
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That is awesome.
It was so fun. So then we went back and forth and I sent her a copy. And then she recently wrote me back and said she loved it, which is so great. So yeah.
Cool? Yeah, it's meant to be. Great connection and what an honor, right? Amazing. Yeah. Thanks for sharing so much. Thanks for sharing, Sam.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much. This was fun.
Have a great day.
You too.
You too. Bye-bye.
Wow, what a fantastic discussion with Samantha Woodruff on this book. And we have got some things to talk about. I mean, what's your big take on this one, Kristen?
Well, there were so many deep themes that came out in this book. And obviously one of them being, for me, just thinking about the state of medical practice, because, there's a lot of obstacles to how the state of medicine has advanced. And one of them being this dismissive attitude towards women that really stuck with me. And again, maybe it's because of my personal experience with Love Canal and seeing how women were dismissed there. But even throughout history, we see where these values and other beliefs have impacted people in a negative way because the research then didn't develop. I don't know, that keeps sticking with me.
I think that's so important. There were so many little truths within this Lobotomist Wife that we can take with us in the future. And I'll tell you, I brought up a little bit about my mother had suffered with cancer for many years. And when we did not go to the doctor appointment with her, when we didn't double check some things, at certain points she was given the wrong medication. Her file got mixed up with someone else. And my takeaway from this is we are our own caregivers today. We have the tools to really play an integral part in our medical treatment and to question things. And I don't want to discount the importance of our physicians. I have several relatives who are physicians. They do incredible things. One is childhood cancer, leukemia, and I'm just so grateful to him for his life work with St. Jude. But we do have a responsibility to care for ourselves, and we have the tools today to do it. I think that's where we're headed into the future.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes for older generations, it is hard being your own advocate because they did come up in that environment of the doctor knows best. You don't question the doctor. But, the reality is when you step back, a lot of treatments and a lot of dosages were developed on men and tested on men, not women or children or people with a different metabolism. So that's where medicine, there are some gaps and there are places where we do have to be an advocate. And that, again, that's very hard. I represent a lot of sick people. I mean, that's what I do in my day-to-day work is all day long. I'm hearing about cancer and illness in my day job. And just hearing the different reactions that people have to their caregivers' advice and the respect that they have for them, there are very generational differences.
Yes, there are. Even with my father towards the end, he loved his physician to the point that he would not even, he refused to question him. He wanted to believe in his heart of hearts that everything he said was true. And I think that's maybe where the older generation needs us. So I just want to add, I had a medical consulting company for about 12 years in Pittsburgh. And basically, we had contracts with different physicians, and basically what we did, I had a lawyer and some nurses that worked for me, we read medical records all day. And we read so many medical records that we became experts on all kinds of back injuries, shoulder injuries, knee injuries. And when I would go to solicit a new physician, they would say, well, you're not a nurse. And I would say, no, well, I'm not treating any patient here, but I am intelligent enough to look at these medical records and understand them. So I would say to our listeners, don't hesitate to get a copy of your records and take a look at your lab reports and your diagnostic studies. They're fairly simple to comprehend. And even if you can't, you can use the computer today. WebMD is a wonderful source to better understand the conditions that you're dealing with. And on a flip coin of that note, though, if you're having a symptom and we look at WebMD, we can come out of there thinking that we're dying too. So we have to be careful.
Yes.
Be a little careful what we look for. So what's on your radar, Kristen? What's your big takeaway here?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm very interested in are these new treatments that are coming online. We talked a little bit about psilocybin, the psychedelic compounds found in magic mushrooms. And I am immensely interested in that because, I know a lot of people who are struggling with long-term depression, and there doesn't seem to be an easy way to ease some of those symptoms. Maybe medication is not working. And so the promise of something like this is very much on my mind, but also the Lobotomist Wife really shows us that we have to exercise caution, because sometimes what we think is a miracle cure may indeed be something that we look back on with great concern. How about you, Krista?
That's an excellent point. I'm going to go right with what you're saying right there, and that's my takeaway too. And I think we've learned from history, there have been a lot of not only medications, but also products on the market that we have been using that later, many years later, we come to find were not beneficial to our health or harmful to our health. So we're as educated as much as we can, and it's a very fine line between just the willingness to try something new and I know we're braving new medications and we're beating cancer in all sorts of different fields today. And so let's stay positive and hope for the best.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
Kristen and I thank you for joining us today. We want to add that we do believe depression is real. If you or anyone you know is suffering from depression, please call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. The number is 1-800-273-8255. I'm going to give a shout out, as always, to our incredibly talented sound engineer, the Mr. Mark Carey. He makes us clear and concise, and this is why we sound so good, thanks to Mark. We're leaving you with a few storm predictions to pique your interest, or maybe you'd like to read ahead. We're going to be interviewing Laura Morelli and the brilliant story, The Stolen Lady. We have Teresa Ann Fowler and her intriguing tale. It all comes down to this. We have Adriana Trigiani and her upcoming book, The Good Left Undone. In the meantime, stay on the radar with Kristen and me by visiting our website at bookstormpodcast.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you'd like to see us in person or one of our amazing authors, check out our podcast that can be found on YouTube.
Until next time, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.